Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your study of the Bible. Socio-rhetorical criticism. With this subject, I'm taking you along on my own recent learning experience. Socio-rhetorical criticism is a relatively new approach in biblical studies, and I've taken some time to get to know it better. Now, admittedly, the term criticism is unfortunate because of its negative connotation in everyday language. No such bias is necessarily implied in the various forms of criticism used in the study of the Bible, such as source criticism, textual criticism, redaction criticism, and a whole list of other criticisms. So the term assessment or analysis or even approach would have been more appropriate, but I'm afraid it's too late to change this. We are dealing with an analysis of the text from a particular angle, in this case a social and rhetorical one. There are three angles or aspects to this: the social, the rhetorical, and the oral one. First, the social angle. This is not quite the same as talking about the historical background of a document, although there is significant overlap. But in general, history tends more toward big events and important people, whereas the social perspective is especially interested in how life works, or rather worked back then, on all levels of society. Since we are looking at the past, we could also call this social history. This makes clear that it is indeed history, it is about the past, but it's looking at this past with a more specialized interest. And then second, we have the rhetorical angle. Rhetorical skill was highly valued in the ancient world and treated as a veritable science. There were clear rules and principles defining how one did rhetoric well. I'll talk a little bit more on this later. Learning these was a crucial part of any good education. It's increasingly being recognized that the New Testament contains many examples of the use of classical rhetorical devices. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and the New Testament writers were certainly out to persuade their audience, and in this they did not hesitate to use the rhetorical means that they knew. Since rhetoric was such an important aspect of social life in the ancient world, it makes sense to combine the two, therefore socio-rhetorical. To social and rhetorical we can add the oral aspect. An estimated 80 to 90% of the population was not able to read. They needed someone to read to them. Written texts were not meant to be read in private anyway, but usually were to be read out loud and often in public. They were the next best thing to being present and speaking one's mind in person. As Ben Witherington, an expert in this new field of social rhetorical criticism, says, they are mostly surrogates for oral communication. They are oral texts, which is not an oxymoron, that is not a combination of contradictory elements. That these are oral texts meant to be read out loud is sometimes made explicit even in the texts themselves. The clearest example in the New Testament is Revelation 1 verse 3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it. That such texts are a replacement for the physical presence of the author is especially true for Paul's letters. They had to replace the apostle when he could not speak to his audience directly. So here is the conclusion that follows from this, the bottom line, so to say. Most of the letters in the New Testament aren't real letters. Instead, they are written speeches. Here are some indications that we are indeed dealing with speeches more than with real letters. Letters of the length that Paul wrote were actually quite rare at that time. They truly have more in common with the practice of public speaking and rhetoric than with the first century practice of letter writing. This is even true of 1 John and Hebrews, which are not letters at all, but rather written sermons or lectures. They lack all the elements at their beginning that normally tell us that this is at least somewhat of a letter. The closest we get outside of the Bible to these sort of documents is the letters of Cicero, written in the 1st century BC. Whereas rhetoric was already an ancient art at that time, Cicero's literary letters appear to have been an innovation. Like most biblical letters, they too do not fit the normal mold. Again, letter is not the right category. What we are dealing with in these cases looks more like written speeches. Now, to be fair, at the beginning and the end of most biblical letters, we do find those elements that were typical for ancient letters. But what happens in between the opening and the closing remarks, that is, in the body of the letter, well, that has little or nothing to do with ancient letter writing, but everything with ancient rhetoric, with the exception of a few real letters such as 2nd and 3rd John. A phrase like, "I want you to know," or "I appeal to you," would be a familiar introduction used in rhetoric, but not in letter writing, to give just two more indications that rhetoric is indeed the better category for what we are looking at in these so-called letters. Now, in our day and age, Paul might have made a recording, done a YouTube video, or used a platform for web conferencing. Instead, he had to make do with letters, preferably letters he could send through a trusted person or co-worker. The carrier of a letter would presumably also be the one to present it orally to the recipients. In this case, it made a big difference that Paul would have been able to clarify the content and perhaps give instructions to the carrier on how to present it. At least he could have explained what he actually meant. This would almost be a necessity considering the following. Imagine having to read a text that looked like this. That's what a standard letter in Greek in the 1st century would have looked like. No separation between words or sentences or paragraphs, little or no punctuation, and everything in capital letters. Now, the only way you could more or less fluently read such a text is if you already knew what was in it. Here's a quote from Ben Witherington to bring this all together. The letters we find in the New Testament are mostly far longer than secular letters of their era. Actually, they are not mainly letters, although they have epistolary openings and closings sometimes. They are discourses, homilies, that is, sermons, and rhetorical speeches of various sorts that the creators could not deliver personally to a particular audience, so instead they sent a surrogate to proclaim them. These documents would not be handed to just anyone. From what we can tell, Paul expected one of his co-workers, such as Timothy, Titus, or Phoebe, to go and orally deliver the contents of the document in a rhetorically effective manner. It would have been almost a necessity because the documents would come without division of words or punctuation, so only someone skilled in reading such seamless prose in scriptum continuum, indeed one who already knew the contents of the document, could place the emphasis in the right places so as to communicate the message effectively. Now, in spite of Paul's denial of using rhetoric in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and the Corinthian complaint about Paul's presumably poor rhetorical skills, as reflected especially in 2 Corinthians, he seems to have been an excellent rhetorician. He frequently makes use of rhetorical devices in his letters, first and foremost in Romans and, ironically, in the Corinthian epistles, which brim with irony and even sarcasm. Don't you know that? He writes to the Corinthians, so proud of their knowledge. In Corinth, he must have held back from the use of rhetoric in order to distinguish himself and his message from traveling teachers of wisdom and rhetoric, often of a more dubious kind. But in his writings, he shows himself a master of the art. And Paul grew up in just the right place for this. The Greek geographer Strabo notes that the inhabitants of Tarsus displayed great love for learning and education, surpassing Athens and Alexandria in this respect, and several well-known Stoic philosophers were natives of Tarsus. So Paul grew up where rhetoric would have been well-known and well-practiced. A few issues back, I wrote on Romans 7, where Paul uses impersonation although he speaks in the I form, is not recounting his personal experience, but rather that of the Israelites coming under the law at Mount Sinai. It's easy to miss this when you're just reading the text, but a good presenter, and for Romans, by the way, it was actually a woman, Phoebe, to whom Paul entrusted what may have been his most important letter. A good presenter could have made it very clear that she was stepping into a role at this point, not speaking for or as the author, but as someone else. Now, since the use of impersonation was not unusual in the first century rhetoric, Paul's original audience would have been equipped to pick up what was happening. Something similar applies to Paul's frequent use of rhetorical questions. In Romans, I counted roughly 75 questions. And then there's Paul answering an imagined opponent, who on occasion speaks back to him in his letter. Romans 2, Romans 6, Romans 9, all established ploys in the rhetoric of today. The technical term would have been diatribe. Ploys that would gain tremendously by being skillfully presented by a performer. So far, we have been looking at things like rhetorical questions, diatribe, impersonation, and other micro-level elements of ancient rhetoric. The influence of rhetorical theory and practice is also visible in structure on the macro level. So what we'll do and what follows is take a brief look at the main points of ancient rhetorical theory. According to the theory, there were three kinds or branches of rhetoric: forensic, deliberative, and epideictic. Forensic rhetoric focused on the past. Its aim was to come to a verdict, and its main use was therefore in the courtroom. For this reason, it is less relevant for biblical studies. Deliberative rhetoric focused on the future. Its objective was to come to a judgment or decision. In other words, a particular course of action would be its aim. This matches the aim of many New Testament letters, and it is therefore a common form of rhetoric in the New Testament. Epideictic rhetoric presents praise or blame and is at home on occasions like funerals, anniversaries, birthdays, official receptions, and festivals. Examples in the New Testament include Ephesians, 1 Corinthians 13, a praise of love, 1 Thessalonians, and Hebrews 11. In order to be persuasive, three things were deemed important: logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is the appeal to logic, the use of arguments and illustrations. Pathos is the appeal to the emotions. Arousing emotions or appealing to emotions was particularly important towards the end of a discourse when it came to summing up the argument. And then ethos means something close to character. It involves moral authority, expertise, and competency as perceived by the audience. For this reason, it was important to establish one's authority and expertise and build rapport with the audience right from the start, something that Paul usually does in his letters. It was common to distinguish 6 parts or components in the structure of a speech. These are known by their Latin names, which I have included here, so you've at least seen them this once. All of them can be identified in various New Testament documents. First of all, there's the exordium, that is the introduction. Here it's an important aim to establish rapport with the audience, as well as to establish one's authority and competency. It's also the place to introduce or hint at the main themes. And this is, of course, precisely what Paul does at the beginning of all his letters. And second, we have the narratio, which is a statement of the facts, often short and often in the form of a narrative. And we come to the propositio, that's the thesis. An outstanding example is Romans 1, verse 16 and 17. Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who has faith." For the Jew first and also for the Gentile. So that's Paul stating at the outset what the thesis is that he's going to prove in this letter. Then follows the probatio, evidence and arguments that support the thesis or the propositio. This is where the appeal to logic plays a significant role. It's usually the body of the letter. Then we have refutatio. That's not always there. It's counter-arguments. The speaker identifies alternatives and seeks to disprove them. In Romans, it actually takes the form of this imagined opponent that speaks up in several parts of the letter. And then the peroratio, the conclusion. This includes a recapitulation of the argument and an appeal to the emotions. By the way, I focused on Paul here, but probably the most brilliant piece of rhetoric in the New Testament is the letter to the Hebrews. It displays quite a few elements of the art. For one, its main part brilliantly applies the technique of synkrisis, making one's point through a detailed comparison of one thing with another. But perhaps that will have to be the subject for another issue of Create a Learning Site. So, the study of ancient rhetoric is not merely of academic interest. It can make a real contribution to biblical studies, and it can make a real difference. And I'm going to end with one more quote that brings this out in relation to Ephesians and Colossians. It's often claimed that those two letters cannot possibly have been by Paul because they are so very different from his other writings. Well, here's the quote, again by Ben Witherington. "We could have avoided dealing with all those long and lugubrious arguments about how those two letters, meant are Ephesians and Colossians, couldn't possibly be by Paul because they sound different, have different sentence structures, use different vocabulary, and so on. Had someone paid attention to the fact that these letters are written according to the style of Asiatic rhetoric, the most verbose and hyperbolic form of first-century rhetoric. This was entirely appropriate, since Paul was writing to the very region where such a rhetorical style was most popular and had originated, the province of Asia. Paul, as a skillful rhetorician, was able to vary his style according to the audience, and he does so in these documents. 26-line long sentences with lots of adjectives and even some redundancies are no problem in Asiatic rhetoric, as anyone who has read the verbose Nimrud Dagstele in Praise of a Ruler will know. As Luke Johnson has said in various of his commentaries, changing of style was a common rhetorical tactic to be persuasive to different audiences. It is not a matter of different authors, it's a matter of flexibility in rhetoric.